Hi there. I'm glad all of you made it back from lunch break. I'm happy to see so many new faces here today. So I have a lot of things to cover, so I'll get started. So before we get into anything technical, let me quickly introduce myself. I lead operations at an independent cybersecurity organization called Zero IT Labs, and I'm the CDO, so mainly technical oversight there. I'm also a member of a research laboratory at the Budapest University of Technology and Economics named Crisis, and I'm part of their newfound CTF team, CoreDump. CTF stands for Capture the Flag, if some of you are not yet familiar with that part. So, me personally, I love reverse engineering. I think it's my love and my life, at least a good chunk of it. I also like to say that I tend to open very expensive calculators at certain times. That is referring to the ability to run arbitrary code. That is a way very often people demonstrate the capability of being able to do that. And like I said, I love capturing the flag. I think capture the flag games are a very competitive and hands-on way to learn about cybersecurity. So that is all about me for now. Here's some disclaimers. So my opinions do not reflect any of my employers. That's very good to say. Sometimes I use pictures from other places. They are owned by their respective copyright holders. Please don't sue me. And I tend to be quite frank, as you'll see. Probably not very agreeable all the time. We'll touch on certain topics that were classified at some point, but everything in here is already public information, so no concerns there. This will be a sort of rant, but it will be informative and hopefully enjoyable. And I only have 40 minutes, so some things are naturally simplified. So, here's our opening question for today. Is cybersecurity hard? Well, yeah. Why would we be here if it wasn't hard? But why is it hard at all? Well, usually you have a lot of things to protect. You have a lot of infrastructure, a lot of software. It's quite complicated. And it's generally too much to handle for any single organization. Also, since we have this thing called the internet, attackers and attacks are very hard to predict at scale. You don't know necessarily who's targeting you, what they're looking for, what their goals are, how they operate. Those are all pretty hard questions to do at scale, that is. And then there's people who will tell you social engineering is a big thing, and the human aspect is, well, a certainly very big risk factor there, also hard to do correctly. And then there's an attack-defense asymmetry, where an attacker only has to find one vulnerability to exploit in order to get into your systems, while you have to do everything correctly. So that is a big factor there. But other than all of these, here's one of my favorites. It's hard because computers do as told. It's hard because it's hard to make good rules, some people say. Well, today I'm here to tell you about how computers, well, they do as told, but who's telling them? So let me jump to a different topic quick. I'll introduce free software as a concept for those of you that are not familiar with what free software is. Free software is just software. But you get 4 very important freedom rights with free software. Those are freedom 0, that you can run software as you wish for any purpose. Freedom 1, that you can study the source code and change the program as you wish. You have the freedom to redistribute the copies of the program as you like. And you can also redistribute your changes. So whatever change you make to the original software can make its way back to the community, or to people that are interested in having whatever change you made. So these are very elaborate topics, freedom, security, privacy, but it's not quite trivial how these things are maybe related or interconnected. So I think it's fairly easy to agree that privacy is a part of freedom. I don't think that needs too much explanation. It's probably all right. But here's the thing. There were studies made where the conclusion was that surveillance silences dissenting views. That is, anyone with an unpopular or less mainstream opinion gets silenced, or they don't get to present their views as much as people with more mainstream opinions. So there's a connection there where you having privacy increases your freedom. And then there's also a connection between security and privacy, because you often have passwords or private keys. So having privacy on them gives you security, for example, when you're doing authorization of some kind. And then it works vice versa too. So the hardest connection there from all of these to realize is the one between freedom and security, because there's a misunderstanding that is quite widespread in the industry, which is generally called security by obscurity, which means that people tend to think that software or in general designs are more secure if people cannot see or read them, meaning that by this argument, proprietary software, aka closed source software, is more secure because you don't get to see how it works, so it must be harder to exploit. But that is quite frankly bullshit, because proprietary software can be exploited just as much, but the attackers doing it are, well, more resourced, so they have to put in more effort to get the same results, but this only levels the playing fields for the attackers and not the defenders. So my conclusion here is that these arguments, these topics are interdependent, not only related, but each and every one of them depends on the others. So you don't get to have any of them unless you have all of them. So what? What is my point here, right? Well, here's my point. If an organization is aiming to do true security, that is not like filling out checkboxes and GDPR compliance and whatever, well, they need freedom. And they need freedom both in software and in hardware. Because if they don't get their freedom, like I said, they don't get their security and privacy either. So how do you do an entire organization's computing with these constraints? Well, it's really hard. But in the software space, there are solutions, well, for the most part. It's very often the case that organizations have a lot of legacy software on hand. And if it's proprietary, it's really hard to move over to, let's say, a new operating system. And also there's the cost and time investment on user adoption. People are very attached to things they use. If you've been using, I don't know, like Microsoft Office for the last 20 years, it's not like you're going to be changing to something else seamlessly and painlessly on hundreds of workstations. So adoption is hard, but you have options at least, right? There's GNU/Linux, where the the Foundation for Free Software has this certification called RYF for Respects Your Freedom, which is basically a certificate that they give out to organizations, which proves that whatever product or service they are providing respects your freedom in regards to what we've said before. And then there's also other operating systems, such as some variants of BSD, which are also free. So given that you are willing to invest time and effort into using these, which is quite hard, in a general sense, given what I've said before, you can do free computing in the sense that you can have a fully free software stack for the most part. So what about hardware? That is a question that often gets overlooked. So my question is, what does your average workstation look like? Well, it looks like this, or some combination, or like something close to these. You have an average workstation computer or laptop, but not many people think about what the components are in these. Well, you think about like how strong is the CPU or how strong is the GPU, but you don't tend to think as much about who's making those components and what underlying assumptions they are making about how you want to do computing. So, as you could see in the title, this is about X86. So, X80 what? If you don't know what that is, let me quickly introduce it. Intel X86 is a family of processors. It's based on the original Intel 8086 processor back from 78. Not yesterday, huh? So this architecture is essentially at the heart of most end-user computers that you can like go out to a store and buy today. And then there's Blue Team, which is very convenient for everyone. Blue Team, aka Intel, is one of the vendors who provides chips in this space and a lot more. And then there's Red Team, aka AMD, who also produce these x86 chips. And then there's another company that is not well known. It is called Vaya, a Chinese manufacturer who has licenses and capability to produce other x86-based chips, but their market share is sub 1%. So they're not really relevant for our intents and purposes today. So this is technically what's called a duopoly. The x86 market is essentially ruled by these two players. So what can you do? Moving away is not really doable. Like I said, you have endless lists of old software compiled for this very architecture, and emulation or binary lifting doesn't really work, at least yet. And these companies make incredible amounts of money by having these licenses and being able to produce these processing units. So of course, they're not interested in giving away any of their licenses or reference implementations for someone else. Well, why would they? So, as far as you can see, we are stuck with them for now. So, let me introduce our main topic of the day. Intel's management engine and AMD's platform security processor. I'm calling this a walled garden, but it's more like a swamp that's rotting like real bad. So historically, since 2006, Intel introduced this new subsystem, which was initially in the memory controller hub, or MCH. But from 2006 on, it was relocated to the PCH, the Platform Controller Hub, that was starting with the first generation of Nehalem CPUs. So since then, this new subsystem is more tightly integrated into the Intel platform. And the official story, the official situation that this was supposed to solve is out-of-band management. Intel has this entire brand called AMT, which stands for Active Management Technology. So it's supposed to provide this out-of-band management for your systems, but you can't really turn it off. So quite convenient, huh? So once again, let me change gears and talk a bit about the Tenenbaum-Torvalds debate. Those names might be familiar to some of you. They're very, very important people, I might say. So there was this argument back in '92 in the Usenet discussion group about the advantages and disadvantages of monolithic versus microkernels, where Mr. Torvalds said that monolithic kernels are better for a lot of reasons. It is a quite complicated topic that I'm not going to open up today. Anyway, Mr. Tenenbaum said that microkernels are the way to go. So this was a quite heated discussion. But in any case, Mr. Torvalds went on to create Linux starting from '91, while Mr. Tenenbaum created an alternative kernel called Minix, which was a microkernel. This is going to be relevant later. So, Intel, what do we know about them? Well, they're this small indie company, just quite a couple $1 billion here and there. And they needed something that they could take, in order to power this subsystem. But they did not want something with strong copyleft licensing, like the GPL. So, please no strong copyleft. Where can we take something from? Well, Minix was licensed under the BSD license, which is free in the sense that you can take Minix and not share your changes with the community. So Intel was like, yay, let me take this. And I'm not going to share whatever I'm doing with it. Quite convenient. So they took Minix because, like I said, it's a microkernel. And having a microkernel helps with having a small memory footprint. And since this was a subsystem that was very sensitive to having a low memory footprint, it was very desirable for them to take something like Minix and probably try to optimize it even more. So, yeah, they took Minix. So, what does this subsystem do, and what is the end platform that they ended up building using Minix, among other things? Well, my opinion is that it's an abomination, but maybe if we don't want to get that real, let me quote some other people here. I'm sorry in advance, because I know I'm going to butcher some of these names. So, sorry. But in 2015, a researcher, Joanna Rutkowska, released a paper titled Intel X86 Considered Harmful, and I very much agree with her. We are going to look into some more details regarding that, but we're also going to look at a Black Hat talk from Christopher Domez, briefly named the memory sinkhole, which was a universal privilege escalation exploit on x86, and another talk from him where he discovered undocumented instructions on x86, and also Maxim Goriachi and Mark Ermolov from Positive Technologies. They are very important people in this field regarding platform security. So, let's look at this paper first. Intel x86 considered harmful. So, I'm quoting here. Joanna says, this is another embedded microcontroller on modern Intel platforms. Okay, well, not too interesting so far. But she says, Intel ME is very much similar to the previously discussed SMM. SMM stands for System Management Mode, another operating mode of these CPUs, often referred to as ring -2. So she says, like System Management Mode, it is running all the time when the platform is running. But unlike System Management Mode, it can also run when the platform is shut down. So when I was reading this first, I'm like, holy, how is this possible? Well, it turns out some motherboards have power states where, with seemingly no operation, no fence pin on the main CPU, this thing can still operate. So it is, for all intents and purposes, more privileged than any other system software. And also, similarly to System Management Mode, it is able to read or write any of the host's memory, unconstrained by anything, unconstrained by the memory controller hub. It has this sort of full access to critical parts of the system with no oversight. So then she goes on to say, while technically System Management Mode can be disabled by the vendors, well, it's discouraged but they have the capability to disable SMM. According to Intel's ME book, management engines are different in this regard because they're too interconnected to other components. So supposedly you can disable them. And finally, the System Management Mode code is more accessible, but the software stack for the management engine, which is stored on the main SPI flash chips, aka the BIOS chips, is encoded using something called a Huffman encoding, which makes it decently harder to reverse engineer. So it's less accessible. And she then goes on to bring up other issues, such as what she calls zombification, where essentially the ME has control over the main CPU and the main operating system. So you can't really protect against this from userland or even any normal kernel environment. And this was one of the takeaways that I liked reading the most. She says, Intel's beliefs that its proprietary platform, which is unavailable for literally everyone else to review, can be made significantly more secure than open platforms that anyone can review. So she concludes, it's unconvincing and also arrogant. True. And another final thought that she brings up is that Intel ME is the perfect place for your implant. If you want to spy on someone, well, I'm not saying it's spying on anyone, don't sue me, but if you wanted to spy on someone, this would be the perfect heaven for you. There's no oversight on ME from userland, or kernel land for that matter, and it has this direct access like I mentioned. So having a rootkit in that environment is like the best thing an attacker could wish for. So let's go on to review this talk from Christopher Domez. I'm a huge fan of him. He's one of the most interesting presenters, in my opinion. So huge shout out to him. He's a great dude. So he presented this exploit, which was, like I said, universal local privilege escalation on any X86-based system. It was hidden for a good 20 years, average lifespan for a good bug like this. Well, once again, this is a really complicated topic, but TLDR, he moved there's a thing called the APIC region, which is a region of memory that you were able to reconfigure to certain addresses, and he moved this APIC region to overlap with the system management RAM, which is a differently privileged region of system memory. So he made it so that the APIC region overlapped with SMRAM, which essentially synced something called a DSC, or descriptor structure. And when the CPU entered system management mode, it tried reading this DSC structure, which was synced by the APIC region, and he managed to gain control over the program counter using information that was mapped to address 0, because this DSC structure was holding a value which was read by the system management entry code, Intel's EFI template, that is. So that way he gained control over the program counter and was able to escalate to full system privilege. So it's quite trivial that being in control of SMM allows ludicrous rootkits that there's not much you can do about. So here's his following talk, just a tad bit later, called Breaking the X86 Instruction Set. So the question that he was looking to answer is, what is the state of documented instructions in Intel's manuals versus what's actually implemented on the platform? And he came up with this great tool called SenseSifter, which used what he calls a tunneling method. Essentially, his idea was that he allocates 2 pages of memory with different privileges, and he sets the instructions so that they are precisely at the boundary of these 2 pages. And when the CPU tries fetching the instruction, based on whether privilege boundaries are violated or not, he's able to tell how the instruction fetching worked, and hence how long certain instructions are. And using this method of figuring out what the CPU thinks is a valid instruction, he was able to go through pretty much the entire relevant data ranges for X86 instructions and figure out everything in terms of instructions that is undocumented on the platform. So, quoting him, he says, "I found hidden instructions on every single X86 chip I scanned." Oh, good news, huh? So, and here's another unsettling thought. he says a lot of overlaps between these undocumented instructions exist between manufacturers. So Intel, AMD, and VIA share this trove of information between each other. They know what these undocumented instructions are, but they don't care to tell anyone else. So my thoughts, once again, doesn't look too good. So now we enter this so-called last era of ME research. Positive Technologies is a Russia-based company. If you read their short summary, this is something that I read 10 times a day from pretty much everyone. This would be your average summary of what we do. But here's the thing, they actually do it instead of, not doing it. So there's two researchers that I must highlight, Mark Ermolov and Maxim Goriachi. They are the key people here who reverse engineered Intel ME and pretty much everything that's relevant around that. So let me go through some of what they found. So this is 2017 April. On their blog, they released this article, The Way of Static Analysis. So they figured out some of the internal file system for the ME, and they also found a thing called the ROM bypass, which is very important. So there's a set of code running inside ME that is part of the initial ROM on the hardware. And supposedly, well, I'm not a hardware guy, but people say it's really hard to dump that internal ROM. So there's a piece of code that you have really no way of dumping currently that's referenced by other code. So unless you have that ROM, it's really hard to figure out what the rest of the code is doing. And they were able to find an image which contained a ROM bypass section, essentially a version of this ROM. So they could start looking at what the rest of the code does. But they are still unable to decrypt significant chunks of the firmware because it uses this thing I called Huffman encoding. It's quite technical, but you need so-called Huffman dictionaries to be able to decrypt ME firmware. And it's not trivial how you would recover Huffman dictionaries from thin air. So later in August, they released this other article disabling Intel ME 11. Well, it was a massive reverse engineering effort. And there was already another project unrelated to positive security by a guy named Nikola Korna. And he released a Python script named ME underscore cleaner, which just deleted a good chunk of ME firmware. And it was still able to complete digital signature checks because the signature checks are done against individual ME modules and not the entire firmware. So you could strip significant chunks of the ME firmware without failing the signature checks at boot. And they also worked out the Huffman decoding, so they are already able to load ME firmware into IDA. And so, you go about your average day, you spend 16 hours in IDA, you figure things out. So they found this thing called the high assurance platform bit. What is that exactly, right? Well, lucky us, there's an Intel executive who cared to respond. So he says, in response to requests from customers with specialized requirements, well, we explored the modification of, actually not spying on you. Well, in this case, he says, the modifications were made at the request of an equipment manufacturer working for the US government. And high assurance platform is their way of making what they think is a secure environment. So, blah, blah, blah. But the takeaway is that this very subsystem that they said was not up for disablement, you couldn't disable it yourself. Well, the US government thinks it's a threat. Well, thank you, Intel. Very cool. So, next up, a vulnerability was found in Intel ME in November. This is from Intel's own advisory. They say that using this vulnerability, an attacker was able to impersonate the ME. Well, that's kind of the point. So you could do local security feature attestation validity. Anyway, the point is you could load and execute arbitrary code in ME, which, like I said, was invisible to the user and the operating system. There's no, like virus defense program or system monitoring tool or whatever that could look at this. I mean, code that you load into ME. So it was a buffer overflow in ME firmware. And the vector you used to exploit this buffer overflow was a specially crafted file system state. So, well, the way they put it is that an attacker with local access could override the content of the BIOS chip to trigger this buffer overflow in ME firmware. But the thing is, having to have local access is not really trivial just like that. You could also overwrite ME firmware on certain platforms because the manufacturers don't know how to set manufacturing mode to off, which you'll see Apple is one of the offenders of doing. So let me show you why this was a big thing. So a historic outlook on ME vulns. Very first one was 2009 at Black Hat. Alexander Tereshkin and Rafal Weizuk, injecting code into a special region of UMA memory allowed them to sort of run code in ME. But here's the thing. The ME is not just one specific software. It also has versions. As the platforms progressed, the ME firmware also progressed. So 2009's ME was a very different ME than what we have today. So this was against a very old version of Intel ME. Similarly, another vulnerability targeting an older ME version. So 2007 rolls around, and here's this other vulnerability named Silent Bob is Silent, aka that CV number, which, well, I'm going to show you the piece of code, or something close to it. So this was the piece of code checking the authorization on the active management technology login interface that the ME was hosting on the network. Well, they thought it was a good idea to do a string compare and use your input's length as the input for which length the compare should be made. Well, this is, well, silly, to say the least. So giving an empty password there passes the password check. So you can see that we had significant vulnerabilities, but they are all targeting older versions of Intel ME. And we had a modern vulnerability, which was more of a logic bug, but we did not have proper code execution in ME on these newer versions. But now, Positive Technologies had one. Later that year, they also recovered all the Huffman tables, the dictionaries, most of the dictionaries, and they published the methods on how you could recover those Huffman dictionaries. So once again, they went above and beyond to put in high effort to reverse engineer all of this, and their efforts were fruitful. See previously mentioned vulnerabilities. Also later in 2018, June, they discovered that Apple leaves manufacturing mode on for ME. Manufacturing mode is a special mode of operation where you can just send, essentially SPI commands to overwrite the ME region. So you could flash older versions of ME, or you could flash a specially crafted file system to trigger the previously mentioned code execution vulnerability. And this is quite inconvenient because these vulnerabilities are not patchable. Even if Intel makes a modification to ME, these older versions, especially the ones in manufacturing mode, can get downgraded to these older vulnerable versions of ME. So any patches made could potentially be reversed on some platforms. So, well, they made their patches, but essentially they did not solve the root of the problem. With write access to the ME region, you could overwrite the existing ME firmware with older versions and exploit anything like before. And also, in July, there's another CV and an Intel advisory accordingly with significantly less information. So I can't really precisely tell you what went down here, but according to their advisory, using this vulnerability, an attacker could execute code fully remotely. So make of that what you will. But Intel comes on to say, well, it's only exploitable from the same subnet. Thank you. Very cool. So one of the interesting aspects is what Mr. Tannenbaum may think. You may remember him from the microkernel debate. Well, this is from his personal homepage. He says, if I had suspected they might be building, whatever, he certainly would not have cooperated with them. And then he goes on to make the statement that George Orwell's 1984 is not really a world we want to live in. And I quite frankly agree with him on that part. So, it certainly has its flaws. What can you do about this, really? Well, let me tell you about my new favorite pastime activity. It is 3 easy steps. First, step 0, you buy a motherboard with an Intel chipset. You unbox it. And you hook it up to an external SPI flash programmer to dump the BIOS ROM, use ME Cleaner to enable the hub bit and strip all the ME modules that you can, and then flash back that BIOS image to make this subsystem inoperational. It's really fun, I can promise you. So, if you're not one of those people who wants to buy an external SPI flash programmer to disable this, what is there you could do? Well, I can't really tell you about specific vendors because this isn't a sales pitch, but you can easily Google yourself or ask me later, and I can tell you about some of the vendors that offer devices with ME disabled by default. But in the long term, I think we really want to get rid of X86. These two vendors are not serving any of our interests, and it's not looking like they care to serve our interests truly, well, as it looks today. So what else is there that we could do? There's a ton of alternative architectures to X86, but they're not that relevant because end users care about performance, probably more than anything. So any architecture you have that doesn't provide the same speed is not really going to be relevant. But IBM has open power in this space, an alternative CPU architecture that is actually competitive speed-wise to X86. And there's another really cool company, Raptor Engineering, who took their designs and released sort of products based on the power line of CPUs, namely those 3. The later of which is quite competitive pricing-wise. So it's not as pricey as like their first models. It's still not competitive to x86 in pricing, but it's not that far off. So I dare to talk about this because these are not practical. Once again, not a sales pitch. It's not practical for you today to buy any of these. But they are the future in the sense that with these products and these CPUs, you may get to have your freedom back at some point. Well, thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I think I'm over my time. I'm precisely at 40 minutes, right? If we still have time, feel free to ask me if you want to.
Thank you so much.